Welcome to the 22 January 2026 edition of the Naval Order of the United States Maritime Virtual History series. As you note the name change, before this month we were the Continental Commanderies Virtual Lecture Series, and we've now turned that program over to Naval Order's Maritime History Committee. Since May 2020, when Continental Commandery recorded the first program in the series, we've recorded more than 70 presentations, and you can find them all at the YouTube channel shown in the QR code in the upper left-hand corner here. And I'll just give you a couple of seconds to take out your cameras and click that to get the link to our YouTube channel. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, I'll just say a few words about the Naval Order of the United States for any of you that may not already be companions. Naval Order is our nation's oldest ancestral organization that's dedicated to maritime history. Our mission is to preserve, promote, and celebrate U.S. maritime history, and at the same time promote camaraderie amongst our companions. Anyone who has served in any of our sea services, that's the Merchant Marine, Navy, U.S. Coast Guard, U.S. Marine Corps, or the Public Health Service Corps, Officer Corps, or the NOAA Officer Corps are eligible, as are their first and second generation direct descendants. So for more information, look at the QR code now showing on the upper left-hand corner, and that will take you to the Naval Order's website. Today's presentation is being recorded on YouTube and will be available immediately after the program is ended. And again, the QR code for that is showing on the upper left-hand side. You can use the same link to watch any of our lectures, including this evening's. Next, let's talk about asking questions. During the presentation, any questions that come to mind, please use the comments box on live stream. And at the end of Captain Lilly's formal presentation, we will have a question and answer period. Captain Michael A. Lilly, United States Navy retired, had a distinguished career as Hawaii's Attorney General and as a trial attorney. He was the founding director emeritus of the USS Missouri Memorial Association, which operates the Missouri as a memorial and tourist attraction. He also authored Nimitz at Ease, on which he presented a lecture a couple of years ago on this very same channel. As a grandson of family that Admiral Nimitz spent considerable amount of time with during the war, they did a lot towards helping Fleet Admiral Nimitz maintain an even keel during some particularly challenging times. I invite you to go back and watch Captain Lilly's lecture from that point. At this point, I'm going to welcome Captain Lilly to the studio. How are you? Good to see you again.
Great to be here, Fred.
And, you know, in your, I guess, law profession retirement, you've become a moderately prolific, easy for me to say, author. This is your second naval history article that we're covering as a live presentation. For those who want to read Captain Lilly's paper in the online version of Naval History Magazine, use the QR code that's now flashing. You'll notice another innovation as of this month. We're making generous use of QR codes rather than asking you, the viewers, to type in 70 digits of a URL shown in a banner streaming below the screen. So we chatted earlier this week, and I believe over in Hawaii, the temperatures are just a little bit more balmy than they are here in Princeton, New Jersey. What are you enjoying, about 60, 70 degrees now?
No, it's actually about 60.
Oh, brutal.
I'm at 3,600 feet on the slopes of
You're
Haleakala, and right
uphill.
now
And you're on the windward side?
it's we're facing north, and it's a little chilly right now for us.
Okay. Well, my heart goes out to you, and I'm sure you're battening down your hatches in preparation for a major winter storm coming along, courtesy of the Polar Express that
Yeah,
we're enjoying right now.
Fortunately, we're not getting that ice storm. Boy, that looks terrible. Ooh.
Okay, well, we're getting to the time after the beginning of the hour where I want to make sure you've got plenty of time to give
Okay.
your presentation. You've got some really interesting points to make that just increases the inquiring citizens' curiosity over how did we miss all the signals when the Japanese aircraft were making their way over Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
So you have the deck and the con. I will bring up the presentation and go to the back.
Well, I think you'll find that this is, other than my article in the Naval History magazine, that you're not going to find anywhere. And I title it Hawaii Prepares for War with Japan. And this was Admiral Montgomery Sickard, who was the chief of the Naval Board at the time. Actually, he was involved in the Spanish-American War. And 1 year before annexation of Hawaii, he stated, our principal object should be to concentrate a sufficient force at the Hawaiian Islands to hold them against the Japanese fleet. Well, December 7, 1941, we all know that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and it was a surprise to most people in America, but Hawaii had been preparing for it for decades, well into the 1800s. So this is a picture of Pearl Harbor in October of 1941. I think it's fascinating because you can see Fort Island, you can see the battleships, and you can see Hickam Field, and all the fuel tanks there in white. Now, in 1843 is the start of fortifying Hawaii, and that's when the United States was first interested in acquiring Pearl Harbor, and that was Major General Schofield, who deemed it a superior natural harbor, although at that time it hadn't been dredged, so it wasn't really very accessible at that time. But in 1875, the United States and Hawaii, they signed a reciprocal treaty that gave the United States the exclusive rights to Pearl Harbor for refueling and repairing ships. So that's 1875. That's pretty early on. Now, the monarchy of Hawaii was overthrown by some people, including Sanford Dole and Lauren Thurston, who are pictured here in 1893. And they stated that, quote, Hawaii was fair game for some colonial power. And rather than see their investments fall under control of England, France, Germany, or Japan, they wanted a permanent tie with America through annexation. Annexation languished in Congress throughout the 1890s until the late 1890s, before the annexation actually occurred. But one of the advocates for annexing Hawaii was the famous naval historian and thinker, Captain Alfred Mahan. And he said Hawaii had, quote, a geographical and military importance unrivaled by any other position in the Northern Pacific. He was one of the reasons why we were able to acquire annexation of the Hawaiian Islands. But Japan bitterly opposed annexation. We had a large population of Japanese laborers that Japan felt was sort of the extension of the Japanese empire, and they did not want the United States to annex. And Japan's minister was secretly recommending that Japan take over Hawaii by force to stop annexation. And even Japan sent the warship Naniwa to Hawaii, and it was the finest, most formidable cruiser of its time. And sending that warship to Hawaii actually hastened United States annexing Hawaii in 1898 by a resolution. Now, here are some of the reasons why it was determined that we needed to fortify Hawaii. First was Japan's defeat of China in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, and then later the Russian fleet in the Tsushima Straits during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, which made Japan, in the view of the United States, as an emerging maritime threat in the Pacific. And in fact, by 1906, both the Japanese and American navies began to see each other as hypothetical enemies. And in fact, Japan became America's assumed enemy in the Pacific in the interwar period between World War I and World War II under the U.S. War Plan Orange. So we were planning early on that we had to defend Hawaii from this potential threat of Japan. And I have to tell you that between annexation in 1898 and the outbreak of World War II, the United States began to fortify Hawaii with what is perhaps the largest and most ambitious military preparedness of any outpost in history. It's phenomenal, and I think you will be amazed when you see the magnitude of the United States investment into Hawaii and defending Hawaii primarily as a defense against Japan. So it all started pretty much in 1908 when Congress appropriated $3 million of funds to finally dredge and straighten the Pearl Harbor Channel and the constructing of a dry dock. And in 1909, President William Howard Taft stated that Pearl Harbor shall be the key to the Pacific. He was echoing Captain Mahon when he said that Hawaii would be the radial point for offense and defense of the United States operations in the East, meaning in the Eastern Pacific. So here's the start. So we're looking at about 1909 to 1920 of the early stages of what we started to develop. And the first thing we developed in 1909 is we created Schofield Barracks up in the Waianae Range area. And it became the largest military post in the United States at the time, here in Hawaii. And then between 1910 and 1914, the Army began to fortify Oahu with 8 batteries of large caliber guns. And I'm going to show you a map shortly that sort of visualizes, and it's phenomenal. So 8 batteries of large caliber guns and mortars, 26 anti-aircraft gun emplacements, and 6 magazines. So there at the bottom left of this picture is Fort DeRussy around 1910, when they started to fortify Fort DeRussy. Fort DeRussy was in Waikiki. We're looking at Waikiki here. And Battery Randolph installed 2 14-inch rifles on disappearing carriages, which could fire a 1,560-pound projectile for 14 miles. And the concrete in this structure is so thick, so massive, that ultimately, when none of these guns were ever used in anger and had to be removed, they determined they couldn't even demolish Battery Randolph, and they turned it into the Army Museum in Waikiki. And if you've never been to the Army Museum there, which tells the whole history of the Army in Hawaii and the whole history of the Army in Hawaii, it's a fascinating free museum right there in the heart of Waikiki and Fort DeRussy. In World War I, the Navy purchased Ford Island in Pearl Harbor, which became an airfield to support coastal defense batteries. And here you have a picture of Ford Island with battleships all around it, and the airfield in the center. The Navy also in 1917 acquired, well, actually probably the Army, was Bellows Airfield on the southeast coast of Oahu by executive order. And by World War II, Bellows had 754 officers, 6,700 enlisted, and an observation squadron. So that you can see that's Bellows Airfield. And this is on the southeast coast of Oahu, over the Ko'olaus and over in the southeast section of Hawaii. In 1918, the United States acquired several hundred acres on the Mokapu Peninsula on the windward side of Oahu, not far from Bellows Field, but it was appropriated by President Woodrow Wilson and became at that time Naval Air Station Kaneohe. It's now the Marine Corps Air Station in Kaneohe, but then it was a Naval Air Station. And here's a picture, early picture of it out there in Kaneohe Bay. Fort Weaver in the 1920s, the most powerful cannon ever built in the United States. Where? At Fort Weaver, a 16-inch gun installed by the entrance of Pearl Harbor. And it was so gigantic that each barrel weighed 200 tons. Here's a picture of the Pearl Harbor sub base, and on the right you can see some of the fuel tanks. In 1920, then Lieutenant Commander, 35-year-old Lieutenant Commander Chester W. Nimitz arrived in Hawaii to build the first submarine base in Pearl Harbor using salvaged World War I materials. And there's the sub base. That's when he met my grandparents. And if you read Nimitz at Ease, that's when they reconnected during World War II, and they spent almost every weekend together and many evenings together. Now, take a look at this picture. I'm fascinated. So this is between 1905 and 1920. And if you start on the far right, that's Diamond Head. And you see all these batteries I've highlighted in white. So there's a 3-inch gun, a 4.7-inch gun, a 12-inch mortar, another 12-inch mortar. Going over to Battery Randolph, there's a 14-inch gun. To the left is a 6-inch gun. And then Battery Tiemann is a 3-inch gun. And then you continue over Port Kamehameha, there's a 12-inch gun. Battery Selfridge, there's a 12-inch gun. Battery Jackson, a 6-inch gun. Battery Hawkins, a 3-inch gun. And then another 12-inch gun. And up above, a 4.7-inch gun. And then in Ford Island itself, and it's part of the home of the current submarine commander Pacific, his home in the basement of it is where this 6-inch gun was in place. And all that between 1905 and 1920. Have you ever seen anything like that anywhere in the world? In 1925, one of the early war games was the Hawaiian Joint Maneuvers. And in the 30s, if you watch my last presentation, there were a number of war games throughout the 30s that proved that Japan could take over Hawaii, could bomb and take over Hawaii. Well, this is the earliest one. And we have the USS Langley, CV-1. That's the first aircraft carrier. And it demonstrated that, quote, a hostile fleet, Japan, must take and use Pearl Harbor as its own base for further possible operations. That created an urgent demand for fortifying Honolulu and its effective garrisoning against future Japanese attack. And of course, all through these war games, the one in 25 and in the 30s, the Japanese were taking notes. And we didn't do a very good job of keeping our own notes about our own war games. Wheeler Field in 1930, that was next to Schofield. Wheeler Army Airfield was the main Army base for fighter planes responsible for Oahu's air defense, and it was completed. And this photograph was taken by a Japanese pilot during the attack on Pearl Harbor, and there you're seeing the bombings that occurred at Wheeler Field. Between 1930 and 1940, they built Hickam Airfield, Army Airfield, on 2,200 acres. And by 1941, it was a virtual city, complete with hangars, runways, mess halls, barracks, recreational facilities, housing, school, chapel, and theater, and they're all there. And here you can see it's basically, you're looking at the entrance to Pearl Harbor at the bottom. And then you can see the airfield there, which comprises this massive Army airfield. Pearl Harbor. By the time of the attack in 1941, Pearl Harbor had a hospital, radio station, ammunition storage, extensive dredging program so that you could get in and out of Pearl Harbor, submarine facilities, 5 major housing projects, a bomb-proof power plant, 3 dry docks, which became critical, during the attack that the Japanese failed to attack those dry docks, and that allowed us to raise up most of the ships that were sunk. But if you see those little white dots in the center and then the far distance, those are the fuel tanks that the Japanese also failed to attack. And so we had ample fuel, and we also had a shipyard that was untouched and dry docks so that we could raise up our ships that were sunk in Pearl Harbor and wreak vengeance on the Japanese throughout the war. Midway, 1940, we started construction of the Midway Atoll's Naval Air Station. And that proved critical because of the Battle of Midway. It was a turning point of the war. The Army built batteries and observation posts all over Oahu. I mean, everywhere. I have a beach place out in La'i on the North Shore. There's 3 observation posts above us. And they were constructed everywhere, including batteries. And here's Battery Cooper overlooking Kaneohe Bay, and it installed 2 6-inch guns from the USS Saratoga that started out as a battle cruiser and then shifted to a carrier. So the 6-inch guns wound up being here at Battery Cooper, and that's Kuloa Ranch, where a lot of movies are made, including Jurassic Park. And it overlooks all of Kaneohe Bay. Diamond Head, it was completely fortified. This is the very top of Diamond Head, and this is a cross section, and we're looking into the mountain, and it was built in the mountain. You can hike in there now, and you can hike up to the top there. You can go into this fire control station, go up the stairs, and you can go to every single layer. And all of this was built in 1910. So you got posts for Fort DeRussy, you have an observation post, and you got a battle commander's position. And I'm going to show you why this had such a commanding view. And here's a picture of my son, Alex, at the top. He's right on the top of this observation post of Diamond Head. And look at the commanding view of Waikiki and the ocean beyond. It's beautiful. And you can go hiking there now. It's one of the great things that I recommend people do. Hawaii, unlike the East Coast, conducted blackout plans. And actually, as soon as the attack happened, we implemented blackouts. But we started practicing for blackouts in 1939. And here's one of the announcements that on May 18, 1939, that we'd be conducting this blackout drill. And then a year later, May 23, 1940, another blackout drill, another one. And they asked people to go out and tell people, if you see anybody that has any lights, tell them to turn them off between 8 and 9:30 p.m. And the last one, only a few months before the attack, May 21, my birthday, this flyer that went everywhere and was also in the newspapers is in 5 different languages. So you got English, Korean, Japanese, Hawaiian, Filipino, I'm not sure, something. But anyway, 5 different languages. We were planning blackouts. And, the history of the first 6 months of the war, the Germans were sinking merchant ships by the drove on the east coast of the United States because nobody was turning off the lights and nobody wanted to. So all of these merchants were backlit. But Hawaii was preparing early on to thwart any ability of the Japanese to bomb us at night. So in 1940, the Pacific Fleet was moved to Pearl Harbor, and Admiral James Richardson, who was the head of the Pacific Fleet at the time, he opposed it, and he told Roosevelt Pearl Harbor was a goddamn mousetrap. And so he was fired, and Admiral Kimmel replaced him on February 1 of 1941. So Kimmel ordered no let-up in the intensive scheduling of training operations. He kept at least one and often two of the fleet's task forces at sea at all times, but most of the sea was in port on weekends, and that was reported by the Japanese to Tokyo. So Tokyo knew that our fleet was in port. And this is off of Lahaina. You know, the Lahaina burned down 2.5 years ago, but this is the Pacific Fleet off of Lahaina. The Red Cross mobilized in early 1941. They knew the war was coming. And by mid-41, they were training for an expected, quote, air attack by Japan. Unlike the people on the Washington, we knew it was coming. And we knew it was coming to Hawaii with possible invasion. And Una Walker, my grandmother, was the chair of the Red Cross Surgical Dressing Corps at that time. And she had built up a corps of volunteers to 5,000 women. And here's a number of her women in my grandmother's yard. And she's in the far right corner there with some of her women. And she and her corps of 5,000 women, 1,000 of them were Japanese women. And they had, over 6 months, had enough bandages what they thought would last for 6 months of war, but they were used up on December 7. And my grandmother, when the attack happened on December 7, she went down to the Honolulu Academy of Arts, where they rolled the bandages and such, and her volunteers started coming in, but not a single Japanese volunteer showed up. And my grandmother picked up her phone and she called the first Japanese lady, Mrs. Asahina. And she said, Mrs. Asahina, you're not here. This is Mrs. Walker. I need you. And Mrs. Asahina said, no, Mrs. Walker, I'm so ashamed the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. I'm ashamed. And she said, no, you're my best workers. I need you here. Please come. And Mrs. Asahina said, that's the most wonderful words I ever heard. Thank you so much, Mrs. Walker. And she came down, and my grandmother had to call every one of her Japanese workers. They were all loyal to America and were shamed by the attack on Pearl Harbor, but they didn't want to appear because they were afraid they weren't being wanted. But my grandmother convinced them that she desperately needed their help, and they wound up down there. It's a very touching story. My mother became a Red Cross nurse and also Motor Corps volunteer. And this is a picture that was in the Star Bulletin, the newspaper, March 3, 1941. And she's there, Ginger Lilly, with Red Cross volunteers practicing first aid on Bishop Street in Honolulu. Bishop Street's downtown Honolulu. And in the background, you can see her Woody station wagon was in the background. And my mother said, I joined the Red Cross in early 41 because I knew war was coming. It did not surprise her when the war came. The Army and Navy held two major exercises in 41. On November 12th, the Navy simulated an attack from a carrier. Radar stations identified them as any enemy aircraft, and within 6 minutes, interceptor aircraft were airborne and met the attacking force 30 miles from the island. And the conclusion of that was that a successful defense depended on operational radar units, a fully staffed information center, and armed and ready to fly interceptor aircraft. And not one of those happened on December 7th. It was completely deficient. Yet we knew that's what necessary to defend against an attack. On November 30, you're going to be amazed by this. November 30, Lieutenant General Short, who's the head of the Army out here, he ordered a full-scale exercise for 7 consecutive days. The Army units from Schofield deployed anti-aircraft units, drew ammunition, and set up stations all over the island. And the Hawaiian Air Force armed aircraft and dispersed them to protective revetments. The warning center was fully operational and launched aircraft against simulated attacking. In short, he was so pleased with a week of that exercise that he gave liberty until Monday, December 8th, the day after the attack. He gave them weekend off. And he believed, and he called Hawaii a citadel. In fact, the Army Chief of Staff, General George Marshall, he said that because of the fortification of what I've been showing you in this presentation up till now, all of the fortifications in the islands throughout Oahu, its fortification, its garrison, its physical characteristics, that Oahu is the strongest fortress in the world. 1 week before the attack on Pearl Harbor, that was the headline in the Honolulu Advertiser. Japanese may strike over the weekend. One week premature. Kimmel said to his intelligence officer when he was told that they didn't know where the Japanese fleet was. They thought it might have gone down south from Japan. It was coming north from the northwest to Hawaii, as we know, but it disappeared. They didn't know where they were. And Kimmel said to his intelligence officer, "Do you mean to tell me the missing Japanese fleet could be rounding Diamond Head and you wouldn't know it?" So now, if only Kimmel and Short were with my mother on December 6, 1941. And here she is. She's a Red Cross Motor Corps volunteer, and she was detailed to go down to Aloha Tower, where a ship came in with Australian pilots that were on their way to fight the Nazis for the day, and she was there for the day, and she was to pick up some flyers and give them a tour. And so she filled her station wagon with flyers, and she said, "Have you ever heard of Pearl Harbor?" And they said, "Nope, no, never heard of it." And she said, "Well, you might someday." And she took them to Aiea Heights, way up in the hills above Pearl Harbor. And the panorama of Pearl Harbor was below them. All the battleships peacefully moored, all the ships at peace. And the pilots start to worry. They said to Ginger, "What? The ships are all sitting ducks. The Japanese could blockade Pearl Harbor and just bomb all these ships, and they'd just be sitting ducks." Well, they worried about it all day. They had lunch at Bellows Field. And then she dropped them off at Aloha Tower, where they sailed off. And she went to dinner on Kahala at a party, and she was playing bridge with the moon coming up and over Coco Head, and with Lieutenant Charlie Bryant. He was a PBY search and rescue pilot. And she was telling him about how the pilots were so worried, the Royal Australian pilots worried that Pearl Harbor could be blockaded and the Japanese could bomb all the ships at ease, and they were sitting ducks. And Charlie Bryant finally got exasperated with my mother. And he said, "Ginger, take it from me. The Japanese can't get within 1,000 miles of Hawaii without us knowing it, because we're out searching every day. They can't come within 1,000 miles. Well, as we know in retrospect, we were searching the southwest corridor when the Japanese, because that's where they thought the Japanese would come from. If they were to come to attack, they were most likely going to come from the southwest, because the northwest was fraught with peril. They didn't think they would come from that. But as we know, that's where the Japanese were coming from, and we weren't searching up there. And so the Japanese were bearing down on us. And of course, the next day at 7:55 a.m., the first wave of planes attacked Pearl Harbor. And here's this is what Charlie Bryant would have been flying, a PBY Catalina search plane around the islands. In fact, it was a Catalina that found the fleet that came down, marching down onto Midway in June of 42. And of course, that's it. The next day, there's the Arizona, and everything, the entire fleet was completely destroyed. Admiral Yamamoto achieved his goal, was to render defunct the Pearl Harbor fleet. So Oahu, they may have been the most formidable fortress in the world, according to Marshall. It may have been a citadel, according to General Short, but with few exceptions, her formidable defenses utterly failed to protect the islands from attack. All of those formidable things that we put together, all those fields, all those fortifications, all those gun emplacements, our battle fleet, complete, and the planes, of course. Short made it so it was the planes were sitting ducks. They had them side by side on the fields. They locked up their ammunition. He was afraid of saboteurs, and he wasn't thinking about being bombed. But that's what all the battle war games proved, that the Japanese could attack us and could defeat us if we weren't prepared. So if you'd like to know a little more detail about Hawaii preparing for war, read how Hawaii prepared for war with Japan in the Naval History magazine, and you can see it online. You can go to the Naval History magazine. If you look for my name, you'll find it there. It was published last month, and you can watch it online. And that's my presentation on Hawaii preparing for war with Japan from the 1800s until 1941.
That's excellent. And again, the QR code on the upper left-hand corner of the screen is the easiest way to get to Captain Lilly's December article. I want to thank you for a fascinating lecture. You know, we talk about training. We talk about equipment. We talk about emplacements. But again, time immemorial, it distills down to people and leaders. And as soon as you let your guard down, you are at the mercy of your competitor who is not letting their guard down. And the fact that we had done it boggles the mind. I hadn't realized before I read your paper that there had been this much planning and preparation. We knew exactly what we needed to know. We knew exactly how to get it done. And yet we wound up with our pants around our ankles.
Yeah, but the Japanese, they learned our lesson. They watched our lessons. There were the three war games in the 30s that actually became the basis for the attack on Pearl Harbor. Our war games, they took the lesson and they were able to successfully attack Pearl Harbor, and we didn't learn our own lessons. That just boggles my mind.
And this month's issue of Naval Institute Proceedings has a paper on very similar concept of, we're doing a great job defensively against Houthi anti-ship assets, but we should be paying attention to the lessons we learned, that the Japanese learned in Midway, where, their dive bombers went against our destroyers instead of our amphibs. They went after the wrong assets. And Pearl Harbor, what condition would we have been had they taken out our tank farms and dry docks, as you already indicated, instead of, the battleships? It's just, we have a tendency to, train hard and relax just as hard. How, and I understand that, the people at the radar station actually reported incoming. And essentially they were, it's Sunday, we can't be bothered.
Well, they thought they were a squadron of Army planes that were due in, but they were coming from the northwest and not the northeast.
Right.
The planes were coming from California, not from the northwest. So, you have to have a fully functional what that lesson learned was a fully operational information center, and that information center dropped the ball.
And you can't be one person who connects it. You need to have a whole team of people who, in collaboration, can connect the dots.
Yeah.
Let's see. I'm going to bring Steve Sinclair, our illustrious Vice Commander General of Maritime History, and Dave Winkler, our Historian General, on board and see if they've got any questions for you about today's presentation. Welcome, Dave, and welcome, Steve.
Yeah, hi, Captain. Good to see you again. It is, how much was expended on defenses for the other islands, such as Maui and Hawaii?
A lot less, because it was less to defend. But they got beefed up during the war. Maui got the naval station Pu'unene down in the flats down there. There was the 4th Marine Division had a camp over here not far from where I live. They had about 40,000 Marines there. All of the landings in the amphibious landings in the Pacific, all the atolls and islands that we landed Marines on, they practiced them here in Kihei on Maui, on the beaches there. So all of those landings were gained right here. And so, yeah, they started building and putting tank traps on beaches. So, yeah, it was not just Oahu, but in the interwar period, it was primarily Oahu, because that was the main. Pearl Harbor was, and the airfields and everything were right there on Oahu. So that was the primary place of construction.
Steve, anything from you? While you're thinking, early on when you were talking about, the 19th century, mid-19th century, back then most of our ships were still wooden hulled, and their drafts were maybe 6 to 10 feet. I have to imagine that even then Pearl Harbor provided lots of great anchorage, protected from winds and storms. So even without the dredging, I don't think the dredging would have been much of an issue that far back. And ships were used to dropping anchor. I mean, even today, you pull up to a buoy and you have your transport to the beach by motor whaleboat. And back then, my understanding is that in a lot of ports, ships would come into the harbor, drop anchor, and the whaleboats would transport the crew and goods back and forth between shore and the ship. So at what point did dredging the harbor really become an issue? And how long was the delay between ship draft requiring it and by 1909, 1910, you were already dredging the harbor?
That's when they did the major dredging. But we already had steel-hulled ships. They were coal-fired, and Pearl Harbor originally was going to be a coaling station. Part of the reason why they were convinced that they needed Hawaii as a part of the United States was, in those days, a battleship had a range, probably a maximum range of about 3,000 miles. But if you added some combat part of that, its range would be much less. And so if you had Hawaii, Japan could have found a way to harass the west coast of the United States, but without Hawaii, they couldn't, because the coaling stations were too far away for them to be any threat as long as we had Hawaii. Hawaii pushed us out 2,300 miles into the Pacific, so it pushed the Japanese even further behind. So that was the function of coaling and how far a ship could go. So that made Pearl Harbor even more important, and why we needed to annex the
How deep was the harbor before dredging? Because I just took a quick look at USS Lippia's draft, and it's almost 22 feet.
Yeah.
And so,
well, I know that the West Virginia is settled in about 30 feet of water. The Arizona is probably the same, about 30 feet. It's pretty shallow, and yeah. We didn't think a torpedo could operate in a shallow place like Pearl Harbor. But the Japanese just developed a torpedo that could operate in a shallow thing. But Hawaii, we thought Pearl Harbor was too shallow.
Interesting.
We close our minds to, what are the opportunities that we should have been thinking, it's shallow. You think somebody could create a torpedo that could operate in a shallow place?
And we did it, a year or two into the war, where one of our subs used torpedoes to attack a harbor. The torpedoes actually hit land targets, as I recall. I forgot the name of the submarine, but that I know I read about it in Naval History magazine.
Yeah, there was the Taranto. The Japanese learned from the British raid on the Italian naval base at Taranto, which was a similar situation. That should have given us a heads up on what the possibilities were. One thing I was impressed is that they salvaged some of the guns off I think the Arizona, maybe the Oklahoma, and included them in the defenses of the island for a few years. So that was kind of neat. Could you comment a little bit about the recent events? I think they had one of the moorings collapsed and threatened the Arizona, and they had to remove that. That made the news, I guess, in the past few months because they were worried the fuel tanks in Arizona being damaged. Did that make the news over there?
I missed it, but the Arizona is still leaking oil, and when you go out to the Arizona, as long as it's calm, it bubbles up constantly, and that's one of the reasons they haven't salvaged things in Arizona, because they're afraid of rupturing the fuel tanks and making it worse. But it's a constant. Imagine 80 years later, it's still slowly leaking oil to the top. But I hadn't heard that.
She was taken out of she was closed to tourists for several months this past year, and there was some repair and salvage work done. Is that what you're talking about, Dave?
Yes.
Yeah. So I recall reading when the divers finished the work, and it was reopened for tourists. That was only like in November, I want to say.
I know it was closed for some time because they have a floating platform that you offload onto to get onto the Arizona, and that they had to reconstruct that or replace that, and that took a long time as well.
Okay, so it was the platform itself, not the ship that.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if there was some other one, but I know that they had a problem with.
And I'll post something to LinkedIn. I'll research it and post something to LinkedIn, to the Naval Orders LinkedIn page.
Yeah.
Steve, another chance to you.
I guess the question I would have is, they did all the drills and there was recognition of what needed to happen, but within the leadership, was there a sense of urgency, or was it just going through recognizing that they may need to do something at some point in time?
I think there was a sense of urgency from 1905 on, and the pace of acquisition and construction between 1910 and 1941 was phenomenal. Imagine the Army, the Army Air, and the Navy were embarked on a massive acquisition and construction. I first had a taste of this with a wonderful book I have. It's called Letters from DeRussy, and it was the wife of an Army officer that came out to Waikiki in 1910, and his job was to be building these Fort DeRussy and other batteries around Oahu, and he did some construction on other islands, but she wrote all these letters home about what was going on in Fort DeRussy and Waikiki and his work in building these batteries and defensive structures between about 1910 and 1913, and it was a massive construction effort when you think about it. When you look at that picture that I posted of Pearl Harbor and Honolulu and Waikiki and all the emplacements, all done in about 10 years or so, 10, 15 years. And not one of them shot around in anger, ever. Not one.
You mentioned General Short's exercise. Had he run it a few days later or a week earlier? And, if he run it later, we'd be in the middle of the exercise when the Japanese came in, and we would have been, 100% prepared, and we would have probably, seen them coming. Had he not given everybody leave until the 8th, we would have been at least at normal manning, and we probably would have been able to respond better than we did. It's just amazing what timing, a day here, a day there.
He also lost his way. His job, his charter was to defend the fleet. That was his purpose. But he was worried about saboteurs, of which there weren't any.
Right.
They had some spies, but there was no saboteurs. But he thought the Japanese in Hawaii was a cadre of potential saboteurs, and so that's why he locked up everything so that they couldn't get at it. And how he clustered all the planes together, which was the best thing from the Japanese standpoint, is to be able to bomb all those planes that are clustered together rather than dispersed out. But he wasn't worried about what he was supposed to do, was to defend the fleet with his planes. He was trying to defend his planes from saboteurs. His thinking was upside down. It was wrong.
So we heard a lot about what happened to Admiral Kincaid. What happened to General Short?
You mean General Short was fired?
Just confirming.
And Admiral Kimmel was fired.
Yeah.
And I think I may have mentioned this in a previous presentation, but they were the guest of honors that evening at my grandparents' wedding anniversary. It was December 7.
Oh my goodness!
And
I guess they didn't make it.
Pardon? My grandmother had musicians and caterers and florists and the sit-down dinner for 50. And Pearl Harbor happened, their wedding anniversary, when they got up, and my grandmother said, nobody called, nobody canceled, nobody showed up, and nobody was surprised. It went out of their minds. And she said they were so stressed that day that she and my grandfather each lost 11 pounds of weight.
Wow. Wow. I think that's probably a perfect place to conclude the questions and answers. I'll just take this opportunity again to remind everybody that your article is available. Aim your camera at this QR code, and anybody wants to rewatch the program or let their friends know that they ought to watch this program, they can find this at the YouTube channel with the QR code showing right now. And then coming up in February, we're moving to Wednesday night programming. And because we're now under the Naval Orders Maritime History Committee, I will give you a heads up about both programs coming up in February. On 11 February, Tom Duffy will be talking about his new book, and that is my notes I can't read. Dave, what's the name of the new book? You're on mute.
Was in the Persian Gulf in the 1980s.
The Persian Gulf, that's right. And the tanker war in the Persian Gulf. And then coming up on Wednesday, 18 February, Ed Marilolda will be telling us about his new book, Cold War Storm. So watch your All Know Us for blurbs. Visit the History Happenings page for the announcement. Again, QR code for the History Happenings page is now showing in the upper left-hand corner. And if you're not already a member of our LinkedIn group, join the Naval Orders LinkedIn group, and I'll be posting announcements there about both programs. And with that, I want to wish everybody a good afternoon, good evening, a good day for those of you on the other side of the, in the other direction over in the Pacific Rim. And with that, everybody, have a great night.
Aloha.
Aloha.